Now, I don't know if you've seen the pictures coming from Edinburgh. It is the Edinburgh Festival. And I think it's a real travesty, actually. You've seen all of these bins overflowing with rubbish. They haven't been picked up. And clearly all these strikes that have been going on have caused chaos in Edinburgh. And I don't think it's a real shame, actually, for what is a beautiful city and a great flagship for that city. Well, Nicola Sturgeon has told councils that the Scottish Government does not have a bottomless pit of money to resolve this strike by local government workers that has led to all that rubbish being piled up on Edinburgh's streets. She says, Nicola Sturgeon says, she wants to see the fairest possible pay deal delivered to public sector workers in very difficult times. But she says she has a finite budget and she has already given councils £140 million to help fund a deal. Now, we've seen this action in Edinburgh, the streets now strewn with litter as the capital continues to welcome thousands of visitors to the city. Joining me now is Noah Khogali. He's a political commentator. Good evening to you, Noah.
Good evening. How are you, David?
I'm very well indeed, thank you. Very nice to see you again. This is, I think, a real travesty for Edinburgh. It's a beautiful city. I think you're up in Scotland, aren't you?
Yeah, I was really sad, actually. I was up in Edinburgh over the weekend, so the strike had only been going on a couple of days, and it was already literally overflowing with rubbish, and the entire place stunk. It's really, really sad. This is the time of year when Edinburgh is supposed to be able to sell itself to the world, and you know, thousands of people descend on it as a city, and it's really not selling itself very well at the moment.
No, it's not. And actually, I felt very desperately sad yesterday when I saw American tourists who'd all come here for the Edinburgh Festival and literally just saw piles of litter, thinking this is really such a bad advert for the beauty of Scotland, actually.
Yeah, and it's really hard to explain it to them as well, why this is going on, because the whole situation is so convoluted. You've had Nicola Sturgeon come out over the past couple of days saying there's no bottomless pit of money, but the Scottish Government had its budget grew by 7.7% this year, and council budget is reduced by 2.4%. So that doesn't really line up. And in reality, she's spending lots and lots of money on little pet projects. So 20 million on an independence referendum that is most likely illegal and probably not going to happen. 10 million on international embassies, which is slightly odd, and 35 million on foreign aid, which is, again, very odd considering the Scottish Government isn't really supposed to be doing that.
So what's the mood in Scotland, given that Nicola Sturgeon is, as you rightly say, spending all of this money, taxpayers' money, on her pet projects to try and go down in history?
Frustration, I think, is the best word. We've had over the past couple of days Angus Robertson, who is an MP, essentially saying this is all the Labour Party's fault because they're the ones in power in Edinburgh. But I don't know what he's going to pivot to tomorrow when these strikes spread across the rest of Scotland. In reality, I think COSLA, who are the group that essentially are trying to negotiate with these unions, have offered 5% now to them, and that's been rejected again. And this is because the councils don't have any money, because their budgets have just been slashed centrally. So it's going to be really interesting seeing how the narrative from the Scottish Government and the SNP pivots now, and how, after saying that it was entirely the council's fault, how they're going to react when this is happening in SNP-run councils across the rest of Scotland, probably from this weekend.
Yeah, so that's going to be really intriguing, isn't it? The minute that it goes into SNP-run councils, she's got a major problem on her hands.
Yeah, absolutely. And the bottomless pit of money comment was quite odd, considering that has never seemingly been an issue for her before, and every economic argument has kind of been dismissed out of hand. But I wonder whether it might just be the rubbish fumes in Edinburgh just getting to her, because she also stood on stage yesterday, I think it was, at the Fringe, and said she felt British. So I'm not quite sure what's going on with her at the moment, but I think there is confusion and frustration across the whole of Scotland, because these aren't just going to be limited to people picking up the bins. That eventually it looks like there is going to be teachers striking as well, and this is going to spread across all of the councils, and that's going to be a massive, massive problem for everybody across Scotland. And realistically, if the SNP and Nicola Sturgeon specifically want to be making this argument that they are competent enough to run a independent country, this would be a good litmus test for them, and they are failing it by every single measurable way.
Well, I mean, you make a great point. If you can't actually make sure the bins are empty, how on earth do you run the health service? How do you run your army? How do you have an independent Scotland? I mean, let's look at her record. I mean, it's pretty shocking. The legal time treatment guarantee for patients broken 400,000 times, whilst A&E waiting times rocket. We know urgent cancer referrals haven't been met since 2012. We know life expectancy has stalled. We know council services, as we're talking about, have been hit by these budget cuts, but also the social homes target missed. I mean, is there anything that Nicola Sturgeon has done right?
I don't think so. I think but this is the feeling even on the SNP side, is that all of this stuff is terrible, but they seem to somehow be able to deflect it onto Westminster and essentially take no responsibility for it. I think at the end of the day, part of what drives people towards something as passionate as nationalism is this feeling that you're being hard done by. And if everything was going well in the country, people wouldn't end up going towards radical movements. You need something that they feel like they're battling against. So it's almost part of what the SNP need to succeed that the country itself isn't. And the whole thing is slightly odd. Even when you look at the election last year, the amount of promises that were made, apparently with this bottomless pit of money that existed then, for every single child to get a free bike, every single child to get a free laptop, neither of which have happened and they don't look like they're going to happen because they were ridiculous policies that never actually were going to be implemented. Because in 3-4 years' time, when it comes to the next election, realistically, they're going to turn around and say they couldn't do it because of Westminster. But in reality, they probably had no intention of.
So you make a really good point. I've never really thought about that. So essentially you're saying that if you essentially have shocking services in Scotland, then you have a reason to blame Westminster. If everything goes well, then you have no reason to blame Westminster. So therefore undermines the case for independence. Is that really what you're saying?
Yeah, I think that might be part of it. And it might be somewhat subconscious. But if your entire movement is based on claiming that you are this victim that in reality does not exist, you need to maintain that image. The other really interesting bit is, I can't remember exactly which SNP MP it was, but a couple of days ago said that if Scotland never became independent, she would just leave the SNP and go to Labour, which does shine a really, really important light on the fact that this is a one-issue party. And if independence ever was achieved, they would probably disappear overnight. And that is also going to have to be playing in the back of their minds as they try and, whip up support in their most radical supporters, as we've seen especially over the past couple of weeks, for this independence referendum that is probably not going to happen. That if it did, they would probably disappear.
But in terms of support for independence, do you feel that's still growing, or has it stalled, or is it in decline?
I think it's probably in decline. I think that we had the Perth hustings a couple of weeks ago, and it was genuinely awful outside. It felt like 2014 again. There was vitriol, there was anger, there was egg throwing, there was words I'm definitely not allowed to say on the radio. But the really interesting thing was that there was actually not that many people. They were just very loud. And most of them had been bussed in from Dundee and Glasgow. And, in previous times, there would have been genuinely hundreds of people. There wasn't. There was a few radicals that were really angry. And to be honest, and this was quite interesting. They were all quite old as well. So this movement, I do think possibly now, especially post-COVID, is dying. And we are seeing the death throes now and, the twitches of a movement that is on its way out.
So just in terms, and we have spoken about this before, I think, on Weekend Breakfast, just in terms of where we're going, Nicola Sturgeon, I thought, made some interesting comments over the weekend, almost laying the ground for her to sort of disappear from the political sphere. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, to be honest, if she was offered some UN women's ambassador role with a really healthy salary, she would be gone in an instant because she's probably at the end of her tenure, she's been an abject failure, even amongst her own supporters, because she's not delivered the only thing she promised she would. And, at that point, she's got to look after her future. And surely she'd go and take some really, really, really cushy 6-figure job where she doesn't have to deal with any of the scrutiny that she tries to avoid anyway. So
let's go back to the rubbish strike. So how do you see this ending? I mean, clearly they were offered 3.5%. I think it's gone up to 5% now. How do you see this playing out?
I mean, it might push up a little bit more, but I think realistically, unless the Scottish government steps in and stops spending money on their little pet projects, there is actually no more money. Just for context, so in Perth and Kinross, which is right in the centre of Scotland, that difference between that 3.5 and 5 million, if paid for by the councils, an extra 1.8 million into a black hole that is already massive. These councils cannot afford it unless the Scottish government fundamentally change their philosophy on where power is supposed to sit in Scotland. If it's supposed to sit in Edinburgh in their minds, then this will just continue until something breaks.
Interesting. Always a pleasure, Noah. Thank you very much indeed. That's Noah Khogali, who is a political commentator.